Yay, we're back.
Hello, hello.
Again with our I just had food smile.
Well fed and caffeinated, so it's a good combination.
Or is it? It could go either way. So we're back to single page applications, and this afternoon we're going to start covering things along the lines of frameworks, AngularJS.
Yep.
We're going to demo, we're going to take basically what Dave did this morning.
Yeah.
And I'm going to, from ground up, do some live coding maybe.
Yeah, so all the pressure is off of me and onto her, so I'm in a much better spot now.
Right, I can do it.
Yeah.
I can do it. And, see if we can convert that to a really basic Angular JS app, and then talk about the basics of Angular and where you can go from there. So today, in this kind of module that we're going to do right now, we're going to talk about understanding frameworks. And frameworks, libraries, frameworks, we'll talk a little bit about that. But we'll get a sense of, when it comes to frameworks, what are we going to, what do we need to look at? What are some popular JavaScript frameworks? We're going to talk about design patterns. Mm-hmm. Design in terms of Gang of 4 design patterns.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. I was gonna,
framework benefits.
Yep.
And I'm going to try to give you some resources on basic frameworks. I don't want to spend a lot of time comparing frameworks. We don't need to go through that. We've already chosen Angular.
Yes,
But, just give you a sense of, what are the popular ones? Where are they typically used? What are some of the benefits? So just going through, and we're going to talk about design patterns, is that, when we're thinking about frameworks and we're thinking about, what we might, or why we might want to use them, design patterns come into play. Design patterns, overall architecture, all those things kind of come into play. And so when we talk about design pattern is an approach or a solution to a commonly occurring programming problem.
Yeah.
Basically what that means is I have to do this all the time.
Right.
Is there a way to approach it that really makes sense?
So what's a shortcut for it?
Sorry?
It's almost like having a shortcut, right?
Yeah, it's like saying, I know that I have a solution to a problem I'm going to find all the time, and it's always going to work.
That's right. Something else to kind of throw in your toolbox.
Totally. Like, you are thirsty. Go drink some water.
Yep.
Always works.
That's right.
In theory.
Yeah.
So, when you're thinking about design patterns, you can read a lot of information about design patterns. And in the resources, I've included some links specifically for JavaScript. But design patterns, they cross the board. We have all sorts. And off the top of my head, we have things like the factory pattern. We have proxy pattern, observer pattern, memento, state. Some people would say an anti-pattern, meaning maybe you should or shouldn't do it, is a singleton.
Yep.
Right? So when we start to look at those things, for example, a singleton is kind of exactly what it suggests. It's one.
That's it.
Right? It's just one. And so if you're looking at something like a decorator basically takes an object and decorates it, attaches.
Add onto it.
Yeah, totally. Dupes it up. An adapter, that kind of a problem you might use an adapter pattern to solve is basically when you need to have a common kind of interface to different things.
Yeah.
So you need to figure out how can you plug in that adapter so that it works.
Yeah. A lot of these are familiar to people if they're developers coming from a more traditional computer science background. Even a lot of the books that you'll read for Java or C or C++ are, believe it or not, really relevant here.
They most always cover these kind of things, whether it be design patterns or frameworks or those kind of things. For a lot of JavaScript developers, some of these things might be new, depending if you're, just getting your feet wet in front-end, development.
Definitely.
So, in terms of design patterns, they come into play, and we're not going to go too much into them, but you'll see them or heard of them referenced. And often in Angular, for example, you'll see something like the factory, idea of a factory happening, for example, and things like that. So you'll start to see these things kind of play out in terms of language.
What I found as I was starting off with JavaScript as well was that I was commonly using a lot of these things, but completely unaware if there's even a name for them.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Especially if you're doing things with services, right?
Yes.
Because you're going out, you're getting something, it's getting the data for you, and you're like, oh, this is just a chunk of code I need to write again and again. It's like a proxy.
Yes.
So we're going to talk about, in terms of frameworks, one thing that always comes up is going to be kind of how do we separate presentation from data? And so, there's a whole bunch of different kind of approaches to do that. The one that we're going to look at is MVC.
All right.
And so MVC basically is the idea of model view controller. Now there's MVVM, MVC. There's
MVC Lite.
There's so many, there's so many variations, so many different kind of things. All of the differences often being, small little details in how you approach it. But, in terms of MVC, the purpose of doing something in an MVC kind of pattern is that you have your model in one place, so you have your data in one place, right? You have your view in another.
Yep.
And you have a controller that kind of maybe takes input from the view, updates the model, or tells the model it needs to update, gets data from the model, it kind of binds those two together.
Yeah.
And you kind of, start to work that way because therefore you're not putting everything all in the page.
Yeah.
It becomes a little easier to debug, right? Because you have a model, you can go to the model and start to figure out what's,
definitely.
This is data. It should be in here. Is there an issue with this?
Right, or you can put in like dummy data to even get you going faster, right?
Completely. I mean, where you get your data from in terms of building a web page could be anything. It could be dummy data. You could be getting it from JSON. It could be, someone's API.
Yep.
It could be a bunch of places. It doesn't really matter. Just the idea that the model just takes care of the data.
Yes.
Whatever that may be. And the view is, in terms of HTML and JavaScript, if we're looking at this, the view is going to be the DOM.
Right.
Right.
So the person actually sees.
Right. It's presentation. And that's all it is. And then the controller, if we're explicitly looking at HTML and JavaScript, the controller is what's going to actually capture events that happen from the view that's going to affect the model or needs to update the view.
Input, a hover, things like that.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Someone, like our form, for example,
yes.
You're going to attach that listener. That's going to be a controller that's going to manage that business logic.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's those kind of things that start to play in. And most of the frameworks that we are going to look at, there is some variation of a model view controller, MVVM, whatever, that you can use any of those terms you want. But at its most base level, it's just a separation of concerns.
Yes.
And so as long as you understand that you have a separation of concerns and that certain things or certain, functions should happen in certain areas, then you're pretty much well off.
Right, so I guess the gist is that you want them to be able to do their own thing regardless of the kind of information that's coming in or it's talking to. Almost like templating these things, so at any point you do want to swap out the data, you can swap it out with something else and it's irrelevant to what it is, or maybe the view, you want to change the styling or where it's being drawn to.
Right. Yeah, or maybe you add something in the view and instead of a click event, it's a touch event. And the controller can easily just change it.
That's right.
And you don't have to worry about having everything so tightly coupled.
Yeah.
Right? So, and that's the whole reason for separation of concerns is that all these things kind of run, independently with references to each other when they need it.
Yes.
Yeah. So when we're starting to get into, any of these kind of frameworks that you might use and why you might use them, libraries and frameworks, there's a difference between them. And that's why I asked you that question earlier about, hey, is jQuery a library or a framework? And I think that you could have half the people who are watching right now say library and half the people say framework. And I think they're both right.
Yeah.
I think it's just a semantic kind of issue.
Definitely.
But if we start to look at library versus framework, a library is usually something you include that has specific operations, right? So you might have any kind of JS library, something that just colorizes all your text, and or a slider.
Yeah, right, one for tweening, for just having animations coming in and out.
Set of functions is kind of self-contained to it, and it usually is organized with, it's a class with specific functions. Might do image manipulation, whatever.
Yeah.
A framework, if you're looking at a framework, and here's how I kind of define it, and I kind of make the definition. Once again, I don't sit around a Friday, talking to my friends, debating this hotly. It's one of those things where I just kind of for myself, I think if it's a framework, it's going to have the structural skeleton of an application. And what it means is that it's usually abstract. And so on its own, if I just put in a framework, it's not going to do a whole lot until I kind of build on top of it or implement it.
That's right.
Right?
I'm glad you use skeleton here because I think it's a very good explanation of what it actually is.
Yeah, and usually a framework will cover the things that are tricky, that are hard, the things that you got to do again and again and again. Yeah, like all those kind of things. So if we're looking at frameworks in terms of JavaScript, and you can think about any of the frameworks that are out there right now, they usually take care of the certain things you have to do, the common problems you have to do again and again in an application, and then you build your behavior on top of that.
Okay, so would you say something like maybe Bootstrap? Would that fall into which category?
Bootstrap's a little bit of
both.
It's a little bit of both, right? I mean, I think that because it has JavaScript and it has CSS classes and it has all that stuff, I do think it's a little bit more of it could be more of a framework.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we're looking at frameworks, best, kind of benefits and things like that is that one of the good things about a framework, and Dave, you had brought this up earlier, which was great, was that it kind of gives you a sense of, you were going through your jQuery example and you say, okay, I always put a $sign in front of this variable so that when someone comes to my code, they know that this is a jQuery object. And for me, that's what frameworks do. They really, really kind of communicate the architecture of what you're trying to build, and so that you have a sense of best practices in architecture and where things should be.
Yes.
Right. So when we're looking at something like Angular, which we'll be doing, typically you have a very specific file structure and things are named in a specific way and those kind of things. It means that I can go to your project and be like, hey, this is where there should be a controller for this, and it should be, handling business logic here. I can look here. So it's already allowing me to communicate with someone else. Right? It allows large teams to work together a little bit more effectively because of that. Right? There's a common taxonomy. So in terms of terms that you use and languages that you use, there's a common approach. Right? And it kind of enforces a little bit of a coding style for you. Right? Because you're kind of like, okay, we're implementing this framework. Here's how you do things in Backbone or in Ember or whatever.
Right. So you're basically sticking to their approach before you even have to make a document for yourselves. Like some people say, if you're doing camel case and the first character is lowercase, then it's private. Other people say, well, I think you should use an underscore first and then it's prived. Well, right there, sticking to the framework and you're all on the same page without even saying a word. Yeah,
I mean, whether or not you have the granular, kind of coding practices in place, it does give you a sense of where things should be. And so, it allows you guys to communicate just a little bit easier. Like, hey, I'm going to work on this. Okay, when you're done, I know that it should have the following files or the following things that are happening. It also improves testability. A lot of frameworks are highly testable. You can go and run any kind of unit test on them. And the reason for that is because they separate out all of the pieces most of them. And so a lot of times, because these pieces are, working on their own and you kind of inject dependencies.
Right, it's kind of agnostic to what's going into it.
Right, you can test these units of code to make sure that they're working. And so your testability goes up when, using frameworks. And so you'll see a lot of this, especially like in an enterprise environment where you have many people working on a large project. They're using a framework, they're running, all their test cases, they have a build process, they have all that kind of stuff. And so frameworks really, you couldn't do that without a framework.
Yeah, particularly with JavaScript, right? Because it's dynamically typed, so they can be throwing in whatever they want. There's no way of checking this, until it actually gets to that point in the project.
Yeah, and I mean, it allows you, like for your example in jQuery, it's a big JavaScript file. Of course, there's other approaches. We're not building a big, application or anything, but it allows, just because it's like all these separate little units that have separate concerns, you can test them a little bit easier. It also allows just a bit more of a maintainable code base because you have the definition of responsibilities. And so again, like I had said, is if something's to do with the data, it might be in the model. If something's to do with business logic, you might be in a controller. If anything's handling query strings or params, you might be looking at routing. The view, if you're thinking about animating stuff, you might be looking at something that's view related, depending on what framework you're using. So frameworks have a lot of benefits. When it comes to whether or not you should use a framework or how you kind of choose, you've got to look at the frameworks and decide what are the features that you need. Right? Because a lot of them do a lot of similar things. Some are more lightweight, some are not. And you've got to, decide, what's good for you. What does your tool set support? Does, all those kind of things. And so, starting off your project and thinking about a framework is definitely the way to go. You don't want to start your project halfway and then be like, I'm going to implement a framework here.
Yeah, it's kind of late at that point.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about just popular JavaScript frameworks really quickly. I don't want to go too much into, the details behind them, but, if we're looking at frameworks and libraries, some of the most popular ones right now, we have Angular, right? AngularJS. Notice they all have really cute icons. I love the JavaScript
I was going to say,
community.
I think Ember wins because it simply has the best looking icon.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, like, hi, I'm Ember.
So maybe our next course will be on Ember.
Yeah, right. So you have AngularJS. AngularJS, I mean, we're looking at, it's very popular in terms of enterprise.
It's actually a Google product, right?
Google originally created it, I believe. Don't quote me on this. My understanding is internally, and then they published it outwards, and now it's open source and people contribute. The beauty about Angular is that it's got a huge community around it.
That's right.
Right? So it's easy to learn. You
have a question, there's plenty of people to answer it for you.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to find it. Ember again, a lot of people use it for enterprise-style applications. You know, it's fairly popular. I think those two could be a toss-up depending on where you're from. You have Backbone. Backbone's actually one of my favorite frameworks. It's really lightweight. And some people would call it a library and not a framework almost because it's so lightweight. But it gives you everything that you need to do for a basic application. It'll give you the routing. It gives you data models, collections, views. You know, you can kind of do the board with that. And so for me, Backbone is one of my favorites. You have Knockout. Knockout's a really popular one. I believe that the Azure portal was actually created with Knockout.
Oh, that's interesting.
So at least the original one, but I could be wrong. So Knockout's another, you know, popular framework. I think it's more of a MVVM. I could be wrong there. But a lot of people are starting to use those kind of frameworks. Now, there's other frameworks and libraries out there. There's like CanJS, there's Spine, there's Batman. Oh, yeah.
These are all just for MVC style things?
All for an MVC style basic kind of framework. Typically in JavaScript, what you're going to get with the framework is you're going to get something that handles models. Right? So some kind of data binding. Usually you have stuff that will do routing. So getting stuff off, understanding what's happening on your location. So you can figure out the URL, you can instantiate the state, you can do those kind of things. You'll also have something that kind of gives you a sense of how to deal with the view. You know, something that you can implement. And then depending on the other various frameworks, you know, they have little bells and whistles and features that you can use for them. You often also get templating. So templating is something that we'll kind of show in Angular a little bit.
So let me ask you, the web is still kind of like the wild, wild west. Do all of these work? Yeah, exactly. Do all these work on every platform or every browser?
Well, I mean, the whole purpose of them is that they should, right? Like a framework should be kind of agnostic to the Chrome that it's going to be shown in. So in terms of browsers, for sure. Now, browser versions is where you start to get into problem. Because it's no longer about frameworks, it's about versions of JavaScript that's implemented. Right? So we know that JavaScript has changed and evolved across the browsers. Every browser.
ECMAScript 6 coming soon?
Sure. Lots of new changes that are coming up. So all of those kind of frameworks, you know, once again, when you start a project and you're selecting your framework, you also need to think about your audience and what browsers they're on, not necessarily what you want to develop on. You know, a good learning lesson that I had on a project was like, we wanted to really push the envelope on this one project, and we were doing everything you can imagine: responsive, loading in libraries, touch support, modular design, like, you know, required JS, across the board, everything. And one of the things I learned very, very quickly was that it didn't matter what I thought the audience was. It mattered what the client's audience actually was. So we discovered that there was a lot of people. You know, and of course, you're like, oh, of course, common sense. But as a developer, you kind of forget because it's the latest and greatest and you want to play with the new stuff. And do you...
I hope it all works.
Do you progressively enhance or do you like degrade gracefully? Like, how do you approach that? And so, you know, it's one of those learning lessons where you're like, okay, well, according to their analytics and their stats, tons of users in IE8. I need to consider this, 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 and this, right? And so you're not going to have certain things in the browser support or whatever browser it might be, right? So those are some of the things you need to consider. The other thing you need to consider too, depending on what you're building, is, you know, if you're doing something and it's responsive or it's for mobile, you know, you want to think about file size of these.
Absolutely.
You know, you're getting a footprint whether you like it or not. And so something like Backbone, super lightweight. Angular, you know, is fatter,
Yeah.
but not like crazy. But it's, once again, there's more file size. You just
Yeah.
got to be aware of that. But
So-
you're also getting more functionality.
Are there minified versions of all these that you can use to
Sure.
actually deploy?
Yeah. I mean, all of these, you can always get minified versions. You can always get, the unminified when you're testing,
Right.
all those kind of things. The other thing to note about these frameworks is, often a lot of people contribute to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, open source, they get updated, bugs get fixed,
Yep.
new features. You have to be very cognizant of like what version you're using.
Absolutely.
If there's any issues in it, do you need to update?
Mm-hmm.
So you need to kind of think about those things at the time of, creating your project, but also in deploying and understanding that like, Angular just updated some things and now they changed the naming of something or,
Yes.
those kind of things.
Yeah, Bootstrap did that from 2 to 3 with a lot of their resizing.
Yeah,
People
awesome,
had to-
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
able to rename quite a bit there.
Yeah, I know. I was like, what is this
Yeah,
new stuff?
I was in the middle of a project too when that happened.
But that's the nature of working
Yeah.
with stuff that's being updated and maintained. It doesn't really matter. APIs are similar problems.
That's right.
You work with Facebook API, and the next thing you know, you're like always going to developer blog to figure out
Right.
like what's going on.
Yeah, Twitter added authentication about a year ago, and then all of a sudden you had to get authenticated to even search tweets and
Yeah.
things like that.
All the endpoints.
Yeah.
So, frameworks and libraries in that sense, you just got to consider a couple of those features. And there's so many articles on the web right now that compare these. They'll often compare Angular, Ember, and Backbone, to be honest. But you can find there's people have done grids and they'll be like, oh, this provides this, this, and this doesn't have this. And then you can use this and things like that. So, you can start to look at those things, and then you also got to look at the dependencies that these frameworks might have.
Yeah.
Right? Because usually you get the framework, but sometimes there's a dependency. For example, if you're looking at Backbone,
Yeah.
there's a dependency on a library called underscore,
Okay.
which is like the single best library in the world.
Okay.
But it has a dependency on that. So then you have to realize, okay, well, I'm actually
Including both of these.
two of those.
And all of a sudden your package size gets larger too.
Right. So you got to start thinking about some of those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
So, once we get into, talking about Angular, we'll talk about Angular specific stuff, but some of the resources I've listed on this slide, it can give you a sense of some of these concepts that, if you're just kind of dabbling into frameworks and you're not familiar with them,
Yeah.
you should spend the time to read. And, a lot of this stuff, if you have no previous knowledge,
Yeah.
let's say you're a front-end designer and you're just coming to this, some of this stuff is going to be like,
Over your head.
well, and it's going to be abstract because you
Yeah.
haven't implemented it, you haven't done any of it.
Right.
So read it, do it, read it, do it. Get
Yep.
get used to that kind of thing. So I listed a couple of things on. Sorry, I don't know if I zoomed in there or what I did. There we go. You wanted to see that up close and personal.
There we
I know.
go.
So one of the things I listed was design patterns in JavaScript.
Mm-hmm.
This is like an online book, and it's amazing. And it'll walk through all of the kind of like essential design patterns that you'll do again and again in JavaScript, right? Choosing a JS framework. Okay, so this has a really great kind of like breakdown of how you choose your JS framework. There's a gazillion articles out there on the interwebs that you can take and look to kind of choose your JS framework. For me, if you have never started before and you're just trying to get your feet wet, I really think that you just take one that has a lot of resources behind it.
Yeah.
Don't choose a one that's a little esoteric and it hasn't been updated in a while and doesn't have good community support. Pick something that people are really active and passionate about if you've never touched one, because then you can kind of, you have that community to get some help.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so to do MVC, helping you select a JS framework, there's another one. It'll kind of list you, through all these things. And what that one does is, Hello World is our typical kind of programming.
Definitely.
Like any language, or like do the Hello World example.
Mm-hmm.
To do MVC is almost like to do is the basic app that you build,
Yeah.
right? And so this kind of breaks it down across frameworks
Absolutely.
in terms of that app. So creating something, deleting something, all the CRUD operations that you might do.
There's an excellent one for Azure that people can download as well, so they can quickly create a mobile service using JavaScript and test right away. And it's essentially that, a to-do list, where one half of the screen is you entering a field, just like we did before. You hit insert, and then it'll add it on the right-hand side.
Yeah.
And you can mark if it's done or not done.
And that one you can actually do in JavaScript or iOS or Android or whatever.
right.
So it's kind of
Platform
like,
agnostic.
does not matter.
beautiful
Whoever
thing
you
about the
are.
web.
Yeah, whoever you are, this might work for you.
Yeah.
So, that's where we're going to leave, just kind of like the intro to frameworks. I'm not breaking all the stuff down, but in the next module, what I want to talk about is AngularJS specifically. Trust me, we'll get into code. And we'll start to walk through the taxonomy of AngularJS, a couple of things you need to think about, why people use it, just going through the basics of it. And then I'm going to take Dave's app that he built this morning, and from the ground up, I'm going to try to live code.
Okay.
Let's hope this.
Fingers crossed.
Maybe with my little dyno typing. I like that, dyno typing. But I'll try to walk you through some of the features of it from a very high level.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a break, and hopefully we'll see you in, I don't know, 10 minutes?
Join us in about 10 minutes.
Yeah.